They called her slow. They called her odd. They laughed at the broad-shouldered young woman who waded the river shallows with her skirts hiked to her knees, pulling up cattail roots, while every other wife in Dry Creek tended proper garden beds and kept her reputation clean. When the blight came and the drought burned every planted acre to dust, and the locusts finished whatever the heat had started, those same women showed up at Willa Marsh's door with hollow eyes and hungry children. But before they would accept anything she offered, they would first do everything in their power to make sure she couldn't offer it at all. This is the story of the season the land failed everyone except the woman they had never once stopped to listen to. If this story moves you, hit the like button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far it travels. Willa had seen the signs 6 weeks before the gardens died. She hadn't said anything about it. She had learned early in her marriage to Desmond that saying things before they happened was a reliable way to start an argument she couldn't win, and Desmond already had enough to carry. He was a good man, lean, sunburned, the kind of steady a woman could build a life around. But he had a particular sensitivity to what people in Dry Creek thought of his household, and what people in Dry Creek thought of Willa was a subject he preferred not to examine too closely. So she had gone about her business the way she always did. She was up before the sun 3 or 4 mornings a week, making her way down the half-mile track to the river bottom, where the ground stayed dark and wet even in dry years. She pulled cattail roots from the shallows and bundled the young shoots before they hardened. She filled her basket with lamb's quarters from the disturbed soil along the cattle fence, with purslane from the gravel bars, with the tender tops of wild mustard before they bolted to seed. She knew where the wild plum thickets ran along the northern bend. She knew when they ripened. She knew how to turn them into something that lasted through December. She also knew, in the early weeks of that summer, that the birds were behaving wrong. The meadowlarks had pulled back from the open fields earlier than usual. The killdeer weren't nesting where they'd nested the previous 3 years. The toads had vanished from the low places near the east fence, and the particular insect hum that was supposed to rise in June had a hollowness to it, like a sound playing from farther away than it should. She didn't say any of this to Desmond. She simply increased her trips to the river. The trouble with being Willa Marsh, or being anyone like Willa Marsh in a town like Dry Creek, was that the things that made you useful also made you easy to dismiss. She was 29 years old and built, as her mother had once put it with genuine affection, like a woman who could carry something. Not delicate, not the kind of figure that looked graceful in the church pews on Sunday mornings. She had her father's wide hands and her grandmother's stubbornness, and absolutely none of her mother-in-law's talent for making everything she did look effortless. She had also, from the time she was a girl following her grandmother through the river bottoms of central Kansas, been taught to see things other people walked past without registering. Her grandmother had been a practical woman who lived to 83 on a homestead without a reliable well, and she had fed her family through 2 bad winters and 1 catastrophic drought on the strength of knowing what the land offered when it wasn't cooperating. She had taught Willa the way other grandmothers taught embroidery, repetitively, patiently, with the assumption that the knowledge would be needed, and therefore the learning was not optional. Dry Creek had no use for that kind of knowledge. Dry Creek had kitchen gardens and grain fields and root cellars stocked in the fall from what the summer produced. What grew wild along the river was what you walked past on the way to somewhere useful. The women who gathered wild things were women who couldn't manage a proper garden, and everyone understood that. Willa managed a fine kitchen garden. She also managed the riverbank. But the riverbank was what Dry Creek saw. The blight came in mid-July, a gray spreading rot that moved through the tomatoes and squash with a speed that felt personal, as though it had specific opinions about which beds to hit first. The drought had already stressed everything to the point of brittleness, and the blight moved through weakened plants the way fire moved through dry grass. Within 2 weeks, the gardens in Dry Creek were unrecognizable, brown where they had been green, collapsed where they had been upright. The locusts arrived on a Thursday. Desmond came in from the east field with a look on his face she had never seen there before. She was at the stove. She knew before he said anything. "They're through Garfield's corn," he said. He hung his hat without looking at her. Half his east field in an hour. He said it was like watching water. Willa didn't turn around. How long before they hit ours? 2 days, maybe less. She set down her spoon and thought about the root cellar. She had spent the last 3 weeks moving things down there at a pace that had seemed excessive even to her. Dried cattail root flour in crocks sealed with wax, lamb's quarters blanched and packed in brine, dried purslane, wild plum preserves, elderberry syrup, bundles of dried wild onion. The things her grandmother had taught her to put up, which were not the things Dry Creek would have considered worth putting up. "The potatoes," Desmond said, "are fine. I checked them this morning." He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted in the way it shifted when he understood she had known something he hadn't and hadn't told him. It was not a comfortable expression. "You've been storing things." "For weeks." He sat down at the kitchen table. He was a man who sat down when he needed to think, and he thought for a while in silence. "Garfield is talking about trying to make it to Selena, see if there's work. Garfield has 4 children and $40. "I know." "He won't make it to Selena." Desmond pressed his hands flat on the table. He was not a man who showed his helplessness easily, and right now it was showing. "What do we do, Willa?" She brought her pot to the table and set 2 bowls down and sat across from him. The soup was cattail root and wild onion and dried lamb's quarters and a piece of the smoked pork she'd put up in May. It smelled extraordinary, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who had not expected to be fed something that smelled like that on the worst day of the growing season. She told him what she had in the cellar. She told him where to find more. She named every plant and where it grew and what it could be made into and how it's stored. She talked for half an hour without stopping. He ate his soup and listened. "This isn't enough to last us," he said when she finished. "Not us, no, but the river's full. There's more out there than I can get alone." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the light was going thin and strange over the dry fields, the particular yellow that came before serious weather. "People will talk," he said finally. "If you go around telling people to eat cattail roots, people will say things." Willa looked at him steadily. "People have been saying things about me for 3 years, Desmond." He had nothing to say to that because it was true, and he knew it. Bet Boone came to the door 4 days later, the morning after the locusts finished the last of the fields on the south end of town. She was a tall, spare woman who wore her worry like an extra garment, always slightly visible beneath whatever she was actually saying. She had 4 children and a husband named Harlan, who had made it loudly clear over the past year that Willa Marsh was a peculiar woman, and that peculiar women were not something Dry Creek needed more of. Bet had apparently decided that Harlan's opinion was not the most relevant factor at the present moment. "I heard you've been putting food by," Bet said from the doorway, looking past Willa at the kitchen where bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling joists. "Opal Finch saw you down at the river last Tuesday with a full basket." "I was there," Willa said. "Come in." Bet sat down and looked at the kitchen with the expression of a woman doing rapid and uncomfortable arithmetic. "Can you actually eat those things? The roots and the—" she gestured at the dried bundles. "I've been eating them for 3 years. Harlan says." "I know what Harlan says." Willa poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Bet. "Your youngest? He's 7 now?" 7. "Does he eat what you put in front of him?" "When he's hungry enough. Then he'll eat this." Willa set a small crock on the table and removed the cloth. Inside was a thick golden paste made from dried cattail pollen and a little lard. "Spread that on a biscuit if you have flour left. It's sweet, better than honey." Bet picked up a spoon and tasted it with the careful expression of a woman expecting punishment. Her face changed. "What is that?" "Cattail pollen. It comes out in early summer. I put up 4 pounds of it this year." Bet set the spoon down and looked at Willa with the unsettled focus of someone recalculating something they'd believed to be settled. "You knew. You were down at that river because you knew something was coming." "I thought something might be. I wasn't certain." "And you didn't tell anyone." Willa looked at her. Would anyone have listened? Bet didn't answer, which was its own answer. She came back the next morning with her 4 children. They went to the river together, and Willa showed them what to look for and how to know it was safe and what to do with it when they got it home. She started with the cattail because it was the most dramatic. A plant the children had walked past 1,000 times and never understood, and the moment you told a child that something familiar was secretly food, something changed in how they saw everything around them. The youngest Boone boy, Toby, pulled his first cattail shoot from the mud and examined it with the gravity of someone entrusted with important information. "It looks like a vegetable," he said. "That's because it is one." He took a bite of the pale inner shoot. "It tastes like corn." "A little. Some people say cucumber." "I like corn better than cucumber." "Then it tastes like corn," Willa said. The oldest Boone child was a girl named Audra, 13, with her father's jaw and her mother's watchful eyes. She didn't say much through the morning, but she asked questions that told Willa she was building an internal map rather than just collecting details. At the river's edge, ankle-deep in the shallows, she stopped and pointed. "Is that one safe?" It was a stand of water hemlock, which looked similar to several edible plants. Willa felt something move in her chest. "No," she said. "That one is not. Come here. This is the most important thing I'll teach you today." Audra came and looked at what Willa showed her, with the attention of a person who intends to remember something for the rest of their life. By the end of the first week, Willa had 6 families coming to the river in rotating groups. By the end of the second, she had 11. She took them in the mornings and some evenings, walking the banks and the fence lines and the disturbed soil around the old grain elevator at the edge of town. She was patient with the ones who were frightened. She was matter-of-fact with the ones who were too proud to ask direct questions. She was careful with the children, and she felt a particular kind of protectiveness toward the younger ones who were hungry in a way they didn't entirely understand yet. Not everyone came. There were families with enough in their cellars to wait and see. There were households where the husband had made a decision and the wife was not in a position to unmake it. And there was Opal Finch. Opal Finch was 51 years old and had lived in Dry Creek for most of them, and in that time she had become the kind of person small towns produce in a particular ratio, one per several hundred people, with an eye for other people's business, a certainty that her own judgment was correct, and the social fluency to make both of those things felt by everyone in the vicinity. She was not vicious. She was simply a woman who had learned to manage the community's information as a way of managing her own position within it, and she was very good at it. Willa had known for years that Opal found her unclassifiable, and that unclassifiable things made Opal uncomfortable. She saw Opal watching from the bank above the river one morning in early August, standing with her arms crossed, and her eyes moving over Willa's group with the particular assessment of a woman trying to locate a specific thing. Willa looked up and met her eyes. Opal turned and walked away without speaking. It was not nothing. The first time Desmond tasted the cattail root soup, he ate standing at the stove without sitting down, the way a man ate something when he wasn't prepared for it to be as good as it was. He set the pot back. He turned around. "That was," he started. "Good? That doesn't cover it." He sat down then, as though his legs had decided the matter. He looked at the pot, and then at her, and then at the kitchen around him, with the expression of a man re-examining a room he thought he understood. "You've been doing this for 3 years. The mornings at the river, all those baskets. I thought you were." "I know what you thought." He looked at his hands. "I'm sorry, Willa." Desmond was not a man who said sorry easily. She knew that, and she knew what it cost him to say it now. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned it over and held on the way he used to in the first years, without thinking about it. "What do we do now?" he said. "Now we feed people." He looked up at her, and she saw in his face something that hadn't been there before, or maybe something that had always been there, but that he had only now stopped keeping in reserve. A plain kind of respect, the variety that came from evidence rather than obligation. "Tell me what you need," he said. The morning after that conversation, Desmond was up before her. When she came downstairs, he was at the table with paper and a pencil, drawing a map of the river from the north bend to the grain elevator, marking locations where he had identified edible plants from 2 weeks of watching Willa work. "If I take the north section Monday and Wednesday," he said without looking up, "you can run the south section and the fence line groups. That way we're covering twice the ground." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. "I should have done this sooner," he said. "I know that." He set the pencil down. "I let people think things about you that I should have stood up against. I'm not going to do that anymore." She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down and started making corrections to his map, where he'd gotten the plant locations wrong, and he watched her do it without argument. The trouble started on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of August. A boy named Danny Stroud had been sick for 5 days, fever and stomach pain that had his mother Edna nearly inconsolable. Danny was 8 years old, and the sickness had come on suddenly, and Edna was the kind of mother for whom a sick child transformed every surrounding detail into potential cause. Danny's older sister Cora had attended Willa's river sessions twice that month. Whether Danny had eaten anything Cora brought home, no one was saying clearly. But Opal Finch had been saying it around. Not as a statement of fact, which would have been too direct, but as a shape, a pattern of suggestion. The boy eats what his sister brought home from the river. The boy falls sick. Someone ought to think about that. By Thursday, 2 families who had been coming to the river had quietly stopped. By Friday, Willa noticed the shift in how women looked at her at the store. Not unfriendly, careful. The way people looked when they were holding something they weren't sure what to do with. Bet was the one who told her directly, sitting at Willa's kitchen table with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink. Opal has been talking. About Danny. About the timing. What timing? Bet pressed her lips together. He ate river food, and then he got sick. That's what she's saying around. Willa sat down. She thought about Danny Stroud, who was 8 years old and had his father's sandy hair, and who had been, the one time she'd met him, the kind of boy who looked at the world with bright, interested eyes. Does Cora say Danny ate anything she brought home? Cora's not saying much of anything. Edna is too frightened to ask her clearly. The doctor? Coming from Ellsworth. Edna sent for him Tuesday. He should be here Monday. Monday was 4 days away. In Dry Creek, 4 days was a significant distance. There was a woman named Miriam who lived at the north end of town in a low white house behind an enormous cottonwood that had been there since before the town was there. She was 78 years old, a widow, and she had declined every suggestion that she should be somewhere other than that house with the efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped taking suggestions from people younger than she was. She had been in this county for 43 years. She had seen 2 droughts, a grasshopper year, a fire that took half the town in 1881, and what she described as more foolishness than she could be expected to keep track of. She had also been receiving a weekly basket from Willa since June, dried things, preserved things, a jar of cattail flour that could stretch what little regular flour remained, and she had been eating all of it without any resulting misfortune. Willa walked to the north end of town on a Friday afternoon with a pot and a cloth bag. Bet came alongside her without being asked, for no reason she articulated, except that she had apparently decided to be present for whatever was happening. Miriam opened the door before they reached the porch. She had that quality of very old people who have developed extraordinary peripheral awareness as compensation for other things. She looked at them both with her small, precise eyes and said, "I heard someone's been saying things about you." "I thought you might have," Willa said. "Can we come in?" They sat at Miriam's kitchen table, which was sized for 2 people and a pot of soup, and Willa served from the pot she'd carried. Miriam ate steadily and without comment until she'd finished half her bowl, and then she put her spoon down. "Danny Stroud had the same thing 2 summers ago," she said. "Before your river sessions, before any of this." She gestured at the pot in a way that took in Willa's entire summer project. "My grandson had it the same week. 3 days of fever and stomach trouble, and then it passed. It follows the standing water on the east side of town in hot summers. I've seen it 4 times in 40 years. Bet looked at her. "Does Edna know that?" "Edna has only been here 6 years, and nobody came to ask me." Miriam picked up her spoon again, until now. "Will you tell people?" Willa asked. Miriam looked at her for a long moment. "Why do you think I opened the door before you knocked?" They stayed for another hour. Miriam told them things she knew about the standing water on the east side of town and the fever it occasionally produced in children, the particular course it ran, 3 to 5 days, high but not dangerous, resolved on its own with water and rest. She named specific years, specific families, specific children who were now adults. She said all of it with the flat certainty of a woman who had no investment in the outcome except accuracy. Walking back through the cooling evening, Bet was quiet for a long time. "She's going to talk to people," she said. "Isn't she?" She said she would. Will they listen? Willa thought about Miriam's eyes and the weight that lived in them. "Yes," she said. "I think they'll listen to her." What Miriam did in the days that followed was what a woman of 78 years and 43 years in the same county could do simply by deciding to. She walked to the general store on a Saturday morning, when the largest number of people were likely to be present, and she said what she knew. She said it without drama or argument. She named the years, named the families, named the progression of the sickness. She said she had been eating what Willa Marsh had been teaching people to find every week since June, and she was standing in front of them to indicate that she was not dead or suffering. She said it once. She didn't repeat herself. She was not a woman who repeated herself. It didn't fix everything. The damage that Opal Finch's 2 weeks of quiet suggestion had done was not the kind of damage that one conversation reversed. The families who had stopped coming to the river did not all return immediately. The careful nods at the store did not become warm conversation overnight. Willa understood this. She had understood from the beginning that fear moved faster than reassurance, and that reassurance had to be earned back one careful day at a time. But the bleeding stopped. On Monday, the doctor came from Ellsworth. His name was Aldrich, and he was a compact, unhurried man of 55 who had been doctoring in this county long enough to have delivered some of the people now bringing their problems to him. He spent an hour with Danny Stroud and came out to find Edna and half the neighborhood waiting in the yard. Standing water fever, he said, without looking for permission to speak plainly. Same thing that hit this area in 89 and 91. Nothing to do with what the boy ate. Everything to do with the east drainage in this time of summer. He looked at Edna. Keep him cool and watered. He'll be fine by Thursday. The yard was very quiet after that. Willa was standing at the back of the gathered group. She watched it happen. The small, collective readjustment, the eyes moving sideways, the expression of people who have just been wrong about something and are in the first uncomfortable moments of realizing it. She did not feel triumphant. She had learned early in her life that being right about hard things had a particular flavor, and it was nothing like triumph. She walked home. Harlan Boone was the one who surprised her. Harlan was a man who had never, in the 3 years Willa had lived within speaking distance of him, said anything about her that could be called kind. He had been the man whose wife came to the river first, while Harlan stayed home with his opinions. He had been the man who said, loudly enough to carry through 2 walls at the general store, that a woman who collected weeds off a riverbank was not a woman to take food from. He appeared at the river on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week after the doctor's visit, alone, without his wife or children. He came over the bank in the particular way of a man who has made a decision that cost him something significant and intends to see it through before he loses the nerve. Willa was sorting dried cattail flower. She looked up. Bet said you were the one teaching. Down here, he started. He held his hat in both hands. I am. He looked at the river. He looked at the baskets. He looked at a point somewhere past Willa's right shoulder that was easier than looking at her directly. My boy Toby has been eating things he found on his own. Along the fence line. Says you showed him. I did. Harlan nodded slowly. He's been eating better than the rest of us. He stopped. He set his jaw in the way of a man who is going to get through something if it kills him. I've said things about you. Things that weren't fair, and that I said without knowing what I was talking about. Willa looked at him. I'd like you to show me what you showed Bet and the children, he said. If you're willing. Come down, she said. I'll start at the beginning. He came down and stood beside her while she showed him the same plants she'd shown everyone else, starting with the purslane because it was the easiest, growing in flat green mats along the gravel bar, requiring nothing to identify and nothing to do with it but pick it. He watched with the focused attention of a man who had decided to learn something and was not going to waste the opportunity, being embarrassed about having needed to. He was there for 2 hours. When he left, he had a bundle of dried lamb's quarters under his arm and a list in his shirt pocket. Thank you, he said at the bank. He put his hat on and started up the track. 3 days later, Bettit told Willa that Harlan had stood up at the grain elevator, where the men gathered mornings while waiting on the assessor's report, and said plainly that his family had been eating what Willa Marsh taught them to find since August, and every one of them was healthy and fed. He said the doctor had confirmed what the sickness was and what it wasn't. He said anyone who still had doubts was welcome to come eat a meal at the Boone table and judge the evidence for themselves. Harlan said all of that? Willa asked. Out loud, Bet confirmed, with witnesses. Willa sat with that for a moment. Harlan Boone, who had held his opinions about her like a man holding a deed, standing at the grain elevator and saying her name like it was a thing worth saying. I wouldn't have predicted that in July, she said. A lot of things happened that weren't in July's predictions. Bet said. Opal Finch came on a Saturday afternoon in the last week of September. She came alone, and she knocked differently than she usually knocked. Twice, quietly, like a woman who wasn't certain of her welcome, and had decided to leave room for the question. Willa opened the door, and they looked at each other. Opal had always occupied her space with the authority of a woman who was certain where she stood. Right now, she looked like a woman who was less certain, and who was aware that this showed, and who had decided to come anyway. Her hands were at her sides, not clasped in front of her in the usual way. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't start with me," Opal said. "The talk about the Stroud boy. I'm not going to say it went elsewhere on its own." Willa waited. "I didn't invent anything." Opal's voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of effort rather than ease. "The boy was sick, and the timing was what it was. And I said what I thought." She stopped. "And I said it to enough people, and kept saying it, and that's the part that's harder to account for." Willa looked at her. "Why did you?" It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, and Opal seemed to feel the difference. Her jaw worked for a moment. "Because you had become," she started. She tried again. "I have lived here for 22 years, and I know how things go in this town. I know where things belong, and who decides, and how it all sits together. And then this summer you—" She stopped. She made a small gesture that encompassed nothing specific and everything at once. "And I didn't know what I knew about anything anymore, and I handled that badly." Willa looked at her for a long moment. The evening light came in flat and gold through the kitchen window. "What you did caused me real harm," she said. "I want you to know that. Families I had been feeding for 2 months walked away because of what you set in motion. I had letters under my door. I had neighbors who looked through me at the store." Opal received that without flinching, which visibly cost her. "But you came here," Willa said, "and you said what you said. That's not nothing." She thought about the winter ahead and what it was going to require of all of them. The root cellar assessments she still needed to complete before the first hard frost. The families at the edge of town who still needed guidance. Everything still left to do. "The winter is going to be long," Willa said. "And there is still food out here that people need to know about. I don't have time to carry this forward. Do you?" Opal was quiet for a long moment. The light shifted on the floor between them. "No," she said finally. "I don't." "Then we're done with it," Willa said. Opal left the way she'd come, down the porch steps without ceremony. Willa watched her go and felt something settle in her chest that was not victory, nothing so clean as victory, but something heavier being set down at last. She went inside. She put water on. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the first evening, in weeks that felt like it was actually quiet, and she let herself be still for a few minutes before anyone else could need something, because she had learned to take those minutes when she could find them. Desmond came in while the water was still heating, looked at her face and the empty porch through the window, and understood something had happened. "Opal Finch was here," Willa said. He stopped. "And we're done with it." He came and sat across from her and reached for her hand without saying anything, and the water came to a boil, and outside the September dark was coming down over the dry fields, and the river ran on below the ridge the way it always ran, indifferent and reliable, and full of things most people had never thought to look for. The winter came early and stayed long, and no family in Dry Creek went hungry. It was not a comfortable winter. There were weeks when the meals coming out of most kitchens were nothing anyone would have chosen in a good year. Thin soups stretched with dried cattail root, wild plum preserves that had seemed like a curiosity in August and became something close to treasure in February. Dried lamb's quarters added to everything, because they added green and nutrition when nothing green was growing anywhere. But the children were fed. That was the line Willa had drawn in her own mind at the beginning of all of this, in the earliest mornings at the river, when she was still the only one who came there. The children get fed, and through one of the worst seasons the county could remember, with gardens wiped out and stores showing the strain of feeding families without their usual yield, and a winter that arrived 3 weeks ahead of schedule, she had held that line. She held teaching sessions through the cold months, Tuesday and Thursday mornings in her kitchen, women coming with questions and leaving with answers, and sometimes with a small jar of something she'd put up that they hadn't known to put up themselves. Audra Boone came regularly, taking notes in a handwriting already more careful and precise than most adults, building an internal catalog of knowledge that Willa could see accumulating behind the girl's quiet, watchful eyes. And Toby Boone, who was 7 years old and had declared at the river in August that cattail tasted like corn, appeared at the kitchen door one Saturday in January with a piece of paper on which he had drawn, in the effortful printing of a 7-year-old, pictures of every plant he could identify from memory. He held it up for her to see. "I found these ones on our fence line," he said, pointing to 2 small drawings that were unmistakably purslane and lamb's quarters. "I didn't pick them because Mom said to ask you first." Willa looked at the drawings for a long time. She felt something in her chest that she didn't have a precise name for, part pride, part grief, part something warmer than either. "You got both of them right," she said. "Come in. I'll tell you how to know when to pick and when to wait." He came in and sat at the table with the focused gravity of a boy who has found something he intends to understand completely, and Willa taught him the way her grandmother had taught her, not just what, but why, so that the understanding could generate its own new questions. The spring came the way springs always came after hard winters, tentatively at first, and then with a sudden rush, as though it had been waiting just out of sight and could not contain itself once the door opened. The snow went fast, and the creek rose with the melt, and the first green appeared along the riverbanks, in the places Willa had always known to look. She was not alone. That was the difference. That was the whole difference, and it was enormous. Bet was behind her, and Audra behind Bet, and a woman named Celia, who had come to the kitchen sessions in November and never stopped, and 2 girls from a family who had moved in at the north end of the road last fall and showed up one Tuesday morning without introduction and simply sat down and started learning, and Toby Boone, who had convinced Harlan to let him come to the river on Saturday mornings, moving through the shallows with the focused joy of a boy for whom the world had recently become considerably more interesting. Willa walked ahead, and the group moved with her, and she felt the season changing around all of them together, and felt the particular thing she had been told was coming, but could not have predicted the precise quality of until it arrived. "Purslane coming up here?" Audra called from ahead, crouching in the gravel with the practiced eye of someone who had been looking at this ground for 8 months, and lamb's quarters past the bend. "Don't pick the purslane yet," Willa called back. "Give it another week. It's better bigger." "How do you know when it's big enough?" "Come here and I'll show you." Audra came back at a trot, and Willa showed her not just the size but the reason behind the size, the underlying principle of harvest timing that applied to every plant, the logic that once understood could be carried forward into everything that grew wild in this county. She taught it not as a rule, but as an idea. Here is the thing, and here is the reason, and once you understand the reason, you can figure out the rules yourself and correct them when the rules are wrong. The morning went on. The river ran its low spring sound. Somewhere north, a meadowlark was back in the field it was supposed to be in, making the sound it was supposed to make, in the kind of ordinary morning that felt, after the kind of year that had just passed, like something close to extraordinary. Willa moved along the bank with the group around her, and felt the weight of the previous year distributed now among all of them, not lighter exactly but carried differently. What she knew was not only hers anymore, it was theirs, and that was, she understood, exactly what knowledge was for. She looked at what was there, she always had. That in the end was the whole of it, not a triumph, not a clean lesson that fit in a single sentence. Just a woman who had paid attention when the land had something worth knowing, and kept paying attention when no one else thought it mattered, and gone on keeping faith with what she knew even when it cost her. The river moved south through the green things that no blight and no locust had touched. The morning opened around all of them, and Willa Marsh stood in the early light with her basket on her arm and did what she had always done. She looked, and she learned, and she carried it home.